Good morning, Team Dominator subscribers. This is a live emergency update as Tropical Storm Idalia has been named just to the east of Cozumel, and the central pressure is now down to 996 millibars. It does look like the forecast track has taken it right up toward the west coast of Florida. There's still likely major surprises in store for the system as it continues to try to really find its identity and also exactly where that center was forming. Last night, the low-level center wobbled a little bit south along the coastline of the Yucatan, and now it is definitely visible on visible satellite, a little bit decoupled from the convection. And my plan is obviously going to be to chase this storm. We're going to be streaming live as well. But I also want to provide to you the latest updates and the forecast as this is heading toward northwest Florida. The timing is a little bit slower, and that's because it continues to meander down to the east of the Yucatan, and eventually it is going to be heading north through the Gulf of Mexico, and it is forecast to intensify. Some of the forecast models even have this being a major hurricane as it approaches the coastline of north central Florida, probably to the east of Apalachicola, but there still is a lot of spread anywhere from the Florida Panhandle, even west of that, all the way to the Tampa Bay area. Needs to keep a very close eye on this. And really quick, I'm typing up this breaking news here as we now have Tropical Storm Idalia. I'm going to break down the forecast. There is a bit of an upper level low in the north central Gulf of Mexico that is up a little bit near the Mobile area, maybe in the Florida Panhandle now. It's sagging south into the northern Gulf of Mexico. And with it, the tropical cyclone Idalia that was a tropical depression until minutes ago at about 15 after the hours when it was upgraded. It's just meandering down there in a relatively favorable area for strengthening. A lot of times these young tropical cyclones will have center reformations, and they're very dependent on convective blobs, hot convection, because that hot convection will release latent heat. You get surface pressure falls, you get more convergent winds at the low levels, and then eventually those positive feedbacks start to take over where you get more latent heat release, more surface pressure falls, a stronger cyclone. And in the absence of wind shear, it should rapidly intensify because the sea surface temperatures are incredibly warm over the Gulf of Mexico. They have been for a long time. We have El Nino cranking in the eastern tropical Pacific, and because of that, there's been a lot less in the way of daily air mass thunderstorms across the Gulf of Mexico and across portions of the southeastern U.S. and the Gulf Stream, the far western Atlantic, and that's led to just boiling sea surface temperatures out there. And we knew that if a tropical cyclone could sneak through the defenses that increase wind shear across the Atlantic basin associated with El Nino, that the thing would just explode. And it looks like that could happen, even though the 12Z intensity models so far still show mainly a Category 1 hurricane. The National Hurricane Center now has it making landfall possibly Wednesday morning, maybe even a little bit later than that, as with 90-mile-an-hour sustained winds. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's upgraded even further. The cyclone's just meandering over the very warm waters of the Caribbean, gradually gaining strength. And then as it starts to head off to the north, that upper level low that's over the northern Gulf of Mexico looks like it'll be out of there. So the more delays that happen with this system, I think that the higher the ceiling. And also the more delays that happen, that trough over the northeastern U.S. might slide out to sea, and then that would favor a more westerly track up toward the Florida Panhandle potentially. That would be more of a stronger storm. I think that's why the GFS and some of the other ensemble models show the further left track being a little bit stronger of a tropical cyclone. But I also wouldn't be surprised if this thing tries to pull kind of a Hurricane Ian where it slides off to the right because that upper level low is a little bit more stagnant, and then it'll get out of the way and then could rapidly intensify on approach to the west coast of Florida. So one thing is for certain with this system is that surprises still remain. That always happens with these tropical cyclones. Very rarely do they just follow the rules, and a lot of times they'll either rapidly intensify more than the models are showing. The forecast models sometimes have a difficulty really grasping the positive feedbacks that are at play here. But we do have Tropical Storm Idalia that has been named just off the Yucatan. Gotta post this really quick. And good morning, Team Dominator members as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining me here this morning. And there is that live post. We just posted it now up on tab as well. So there is the infrared. Let me show you what the visible looks like. And you might think that with that infrared satellite imagery that the center is right near that blob that's off to the south of the Yucatan. But then you pull up the visible satellite and you can certainly see where that exposed low-level center is located. But hurricane reconnaissance aircraft has picked up on that lower pressure, 996 millibars. And there you can see the center right there. That's the center of Idalia. And this is a convective blob that kind of dragged that center off to the south. So it was up here off the northeastern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, and then it got dragged and propagated a little bit off to the south. And a lot of times these young tropical cyclones are very dependent on these blobs of convection that will develop. A lot of times the convection will explode in the overnight hours. And underneath these convective blobs, you get surface pressure falls because of the release of latent heat aloft. That's why I call it hot convection. But then as you get toward the morning hours, sometimes that convection will lose its intensity and then you'll see these low-level centers get exposed. But it's definitely ripping down there a little bit further south, taking its time a little bit longer, and the change in timing has been reflected in the National Hurricane Center cone, having it make landfall now, possibly Wednesday morning, maybe even Wednesday afternoon. And here are the latest hurricane model tracks. This is from tropicaltidbits.com. It's not an official forecast. These are just the 12Z hurricane models. And you can definitely see this anticyclonic curvature. It certainly wants to also be dragged across the coastline of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina during late next week. And that could lead to a major coastal flooding event along that area as well. But I also see these new members that are a little bit further right. And I wonder if that's a trend off to the right. You can see that there are no members up into the Florida Panhandle. And I believe that that's because of this upper level low that's located over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico right now. I'm going to show that to you, and then we're going to discuss the timing. And it's going to meander off to the southeast and then eventually eject out ahead of the system. So the longer Idalia sits here and spins to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula, this upper level low will eventually lose its influence over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. And also, as this system accelerates off to north in a storm relative sense, it should have a lot less wind shear on approach to the west coast of Florida. So I wouldn't be surprised if this thing is a major hurricane. But it is important to note that the hurricane model forecasts overall have trended a little bit down this morning. And that might be because that upper level low over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico is going to be a little bit more stagnant. That could lead to a slightly tilted system. And that's why a lot of these models show Idalia strengthening into a category 1 at landfall. But the National Hurricane Center thinks it's going to be a little bit stronger. And the HWRF models, some of those high resolution hurricane models that often overpredict the intensity of a hurricane, they're really picking up on that warm water that's in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, 31 degrees Celsius out there, even warmer than that. And the HWRF is bottoming this thing out into a major hurricane. So I'm going to show you those as well. But a majority of these intensity models do show a category 1 hurricane, but I wouldn't be surprised if this thing just rockets again on approach, just based on how the last 3 years have gone in the Gulf of Mexico with these hurricanes. I mean, even Tropical Storm Harold intensified at the last second before making landfall down to the south of Corpus. Here's the official National Hurricane Center track. And notice that the cone now is east of that far western tip of the Florida Panhandle. That includes the Pensacola area, but of course Apalachicola still included in that cone. And the impacts can extend well outside of the cone as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some major coastal flooding issues along the entire west coast of Florida as this hurricane is just offshore. Anytime you get that onshore flow near the west coast of Florida, it's a very storm surge prone area. So even though Tampa Bay appears to be outside of the cone, barely, I still think that there could be some major impacts. And I wouldn't be surprised if it does hedge a little bit closer to the Tampa area as well. Right now, though, looks like it is kind of heading toward the St. Marks area, a little bit further east now on the latest track. This area here in the Florida Big Bend is a very difficult place to chase. It's a lot of low, swampy land, a lot of marshy land down there. It's hard to access the coast. You have to get on a barrier island. You'll likely lose your vehicle, swamp your vehicle out there. So you definitely want to heed those evacuation orders too, because you don't want to be trapped on those barrier islands, or even worse, find yourself in a life-threatening situation out there. But I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing an impact of a major hurricane. I was hoping for kind of an easy chase, honestly, because these major hurricanes are such a commitment. I lost my vehicle last year during Hurricane Ian. Good chance I'll lose my vehicle again this year. I'll have to get the hood towed out of there. And that's because I really want to show you the storm surge conditions as they're happening. And to do that, sometimes you have to put yourself in a situation that is not favorable for the vehicle that you might be in. But look at this. It does look like it's going to be moving right up the coastline, maybe even just off the coastline, which would allow it to intensify even a little bit more. But that's going to lead to a major coastal flooding event, damaging winds all the way up the seaboard once again. But the worst impacts could be felt there in Florida. And this is the official National Hurricane Center track. It still says Tropical Depression 10. I need to update that as well because it is now officially a tropical storm, of course. So now we're going to look at some of these models. This is the 6Z GFS, and I want to show you that upper level low that is spinning over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico because I do think that this thing is important, and it is very high up as well, as you can see. Let's see if I can draw on this. There we go. A little bit further down, folks. So there's the upper level low spinning away, and you can see the counterclockwise spin with it. Of course, a lot stronger of the flow on the east side. This is a subtropical low, and a lot of times these will be a little bit stronger than normal during El Nino because of the energized subtropical jet, even though we're in the middle of summer and the subtropical jet should be largely suppressed. But you can see these westerly and southwesterly upper level winds. Look at the timing too. By Tuesday, they do start to clear out, especially by Wednesday. You start to lose the influence of that wind shear. And that's also going to be when the tropical cyclone is approaching the coastline here. So I think once this upper level low gets off to the northeast and its influence is not felt over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, then I think you're going to see the tropical cyclone come up here in a very favorable environment for rapid intensification. And we'll probably see a Category 2, maybe even a Cat 3 hurricane, maybe even stronger than that as well. So you don't want to let your guard down out here across the west coast of Florida. We know how this goes. These intensity forecasts a lot of times will show a Category 1 storm, and then they end up just being a lot stronger. And there you can see the tropical cyclone with the GFS model headed right up into that gap, close to the St. Mark's area. It's a stronger solution, so it is a little bit further west. And I noticed that the GFS model, the western tracks are with a stronger tropical cyclone, and the eastern tracks are a little bit weaker. And I believe that's mainly because of the delays in timing. The longer that tropical cyclone spins off the Yucatan, it'll allow that upper level low to leave the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, and then it'll have a more favorable environment to intensify over those very warm waters. But this is on Tuesday, the influence of the upper low still felt, and then it's gone by Tuesday night, and then the thing rapidly intensifies. The GFS is showing it as a sub 960 millibar low when it comes in, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is even a little bit stronger than that when it does eventually arrive. And as I mentioned, it was the hurricane reconnaissance that is what led to the upgrade in hurricane intensity, and we're going to head on over to one of our favorite websites for tracking these tropical cyclones, and that is the tropicaltidbits.com, run by Dr. Levi Cohen, just a great scientist. And you can see that extrapolated mean sea level pressure is down to 996 millibars. So that was the latest update. You can see that graph on the left. Notice that red line right there, that's the mean sea level pressure. And it drops almost all the way down to the surface before going up. That's 996 millibars. It's extrapolated down to the surface, excuse me. And that's what led to the upgrade to the tropical storm. It's a pretty low pressure, lower than the models were showing. And also notice in the center how the flight level winds decrease as well. So there is a little bit of a calm near that closed center additionally. And the heroes that are the hurricane hunters out there are always measuring this information. And this is what provides us with real-time updates from inside of the storm. I've always wanted to travel with the hurricane hunters out there. Hopefully I'll get an opportunity one of these days, but I also like to be on the ground, covering the ground of relative conditions as they evolve. And it's right near the center here, and as we showed on visible satellite, it is a little bit exposed. This was that convective blob that kind of dragged the center a little bit off to the south, and it's just going to meander down here until Monday, and then it'll start drifting off to the north, right through the Yucatan Strait there, west of Cuba. And remember with Hurricane Ian, it ended up tracking a little deeper into Cuba, and it was pretty obvious it was taking that further right track right from the get-go. This one's taking kind of a track similar to Hurricane Michael, except a little bit further east, but I promise you there's still likely going to be surprises with this storm as we head right up into landfall. So definitely fairly intense. You got to take this thing seriously. I do want to show you some of the sea surface temperatures out there as well. And we'll head on over first to the sea surface temperatures. And it shows you the Pacific is just on fire in the eastern tropical Pacific. So we do have a raging El Nino, especially in the eastern tropical Pacific. A lot of times the official prediction is based kind of on this Nino 3.4 region over the central Pacific, but it's a very strong eastern Pacific El Nino, and this has a big influence over the Atlantic. Usually it leads to very strong wind shear and a less favorable atmospheric conditions for development, especially deeper in the Atlantic. But this one, Idalia, was a Central American gyre, or a CAG, that develops from a blob of convection right over Central America. It gradually develops that cyclonic spin, and then we start to get those convective bursts overnight. That'll help lead to a closed center, and that's happening right now just off east of Cozumel. We had Tropical Storm Idalia that formed, but look at how warm the Gulf of Mexico is just upstream, and especially right along the immediate coastline there. You can see some even higher sea surface temperatures along the immediate coastline of the Gulf of Mexico. And that certainly could be the case out there. You can zoom in a little bit to the Gulf. And usually when you get greater upwelling, you'll see a little ribbon of some stable or cooler anomalies right along the coastline. But we have got those high anomalies right along the immediate coastline from the Florida Panhandle all the way through the Florida Big Bend. And even the Gulf Stream is warm too, off the coastline of South Carolina and North Carolina. Those waters over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico are about 31 degrees C. And you may remember during Ian last year, the water temperatures over the central and northern Gulf of Mexico were relatively cool. And then over the loop current over the southeastern Gulf of Mexico, they were a little bit warmer. And I believe that that helped encourage Ian to propagate off to the right, take a further right track, and impacted southwestern Florida. Obviously, Fort Myers doesn't need another impact from a hurricane. But it looks like this one should be further north. There's a lot more warm water up across the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. And so I am hoping that, well, it'll go further north, but then the bad impacts will be headed further north as well. I am heading down there tomorrow to chase this thing live. And we'll probably be going live. Oh yeah, look at that Gulf of Mexico just cooking. That's the 30-degree ISO line. And you can definitely see the usual Gulf Stream is obviously warm, but look at the Gulf of Mexico, a lot warmer. And that's just been cooking for years now out there. Sea of Cortez as well. There you can see the Gulf Stream up the East Coast. So if Idalia takes that further right track, it'll probably be just offshore and will stay over those warm waters, and that would lead to an even worse coastal flooding and wind situation from eastern Georgia all the way up South Carolina as well. A state of emergency has been declared for the state of Florida, and that's because this is going to be a big ripper again. Look at this going right over the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It's untainted so far by any strong tropical cyclones so far this year, so you don't see any anomalous upwelling or happening, just basically an untainted area, very warm water, just rocket fuel for these tropical cyclones to intensify. I've always thought, though, that the atmospheric conditions are a lot more important, and that upper level low in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico could help to temper the intensification a little bit until it gets right up to the coastline, and then it could rapidly intensify. And the models are also showing a fairly compact tropical cyclone, a little bit smaller in size, and that's also not necessarily a good thing either. These are some of the raw SSTs. See how they're a lot warmer. And there, we're looking at basically when it shifts to yellow, that's when it gets above 31 degrees C, kind of an automated scale there at the bottom. But you can definitely see that warm water just off the immediate coastline. That's going to be an issue for this system. It's a little bit different. The sea surface temperatures are different than Ian. You can see a lot of these warm waters just off the coastline. including in the Citrus Coast too, and also just off Tampa Bay. And you're still in the cone in Tampa Bay, so wouldn't be surprised if a very strong hurricane comes up, and you're going to have very strong southwesterly winds in there, a very storm surge prone west coast of Florida. St. Petersburg is probably going to be underwater, even if this thing comes up north into that gap. Both of these areas are going to be flooded out. You got Fort Myers area off to the south. You got Tampa Bay off to the north. This concavity in southwestern Florida just got hammered, but you don't have as much of that warm water concentrated over the southeastern Gulf of Mexico that you had with Ian. That took it a little bit further to the right near Cuba, and then eventually curled in toward the immediate Florida coastline, a little further north than what I drew there. This one's taking a little bit more of a Michael track, but a little east of that, so kind of a hybrid off to the northeast. And we do have that upper level low that's going to be spinning through Tuesday up here in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. To the south of that, it should lead to a little bit of west to east storm relative wind shear, but then those upper level winds gradually weaken and shift to a more southerly direction. So then as a Hurricane Idalia by that time starts to head north toward the Florida coastline, it's going to have an even more favorable area for intensification. Look at how warm these marshes are. And a lot of that is because we've had a lot less in the way of air mass thunderstorms across the southeastern U.S. and the central Gulf Coast, and it's just been cooking out here. These shallower waters along the northern Gulf of Mexico have been baking in the absence of those daily air mass thunderstorms that area is so dependent on. So I do want to show you the HWRF model. I did a pretty good job analyzing this. This is 18Z Sunday. This was initialized last night at 6Z. I'm sure that the 12Z models are coming out soon. Keep in mind, though, a lot of times the HWRF will overdo intensification of these tropical cyclones, especially in the presence of such hot sea surface temperatures. It could be an issue kind of understanding the relationship between the ocean surface and the overlying atmosphere. But it did a pretty good job with initializing this blob of convection over the southern side, a little bit of an exposed center. I think the center is a little northeast of this location too, so it is a little bit further west with that center. Keep that in mind as well. I think the center's out a little bit closer to the 86-degree west longitude line. But let's step forward with time. Looks like it wraps around some convection by this evening. And hell, we might even have a hurricane a little bit faster. Look at that as it's passing right between Cuba and the Yucatan. 986. It's already further east on the HWRF than many of the models were showing, and it really starts to bottom out as it gets into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. This is by Tuesday morning, and remember, further north, we do get a lot of that westerly wind shear, but this storm is still going to be south of that influence, and I don't think that upper level low is going to be much of an issue, at least according to some of these hurricane models. You got a 968 millibar low, and look at it is trending further right, and it's still intense too. This would be just devastating for the coastline of Florida. You can see Pine Island down here, the Fort Myers area. You can see Sanibel as well, Captiva Island. That was the area that was impacted by Hurricane Ian. But remember, initially the forecast for Hurricane Ian took it off to the north like this one. So just remember, there are always surprises, and anywhere along the west coast of Florida needs to keep an eye out for this one. This would be devastating for the Tampa Bay area. Very powerful, major hurricane just offshore, and anything just to the right or to the north of Tampa Bay would bring those powerful southwesterly winds into Tampa Bay. Everything would be flooded out. Clearwater Beach would have big problems as well. And it takes it off a little bit further east. Yesterday, remember the HWRF was way off to the west. So generally these hurricane models are good right up to landfall when you're trying to figure out how the structure of the hurricane will change, but they're not as good at predicting the exact forecast track. And we'll just sit here and reload these. This is the 6C HWRF model. But it does show a pretty powerful hurricane making landfall. Wouldn't be surprised if it is a Category 2 storm when that comes in. But this HWRF is far from an official forecast, that is for sure. Let's see what the spaghetti plots show. So we'll head on over to Pivotal Weather. All right, we'll use the different ensemble members. And it looks like the 12Z GFS is coming in right now. So let's actually pivot on over to the operational GFS first. So it's also a great spot for analysis of these tropical cyclones. And there it is. This is the new GFS, the 12Z operational GFS, showing a likely low-end hurricane moving through the southern Gulf of Mexico. This is 18Z Tuesday, so it still is a little bit slower. And look at that thing blossom by Tuesday evening. That says the upper level low is getting out of the way. The upper level winds are starting to become a lot more conducive by this time for rapid strengthening. You can see you have a lot of southerly flow in the wake of that upper level low. And this thing's going to be moving north at a similar speed. So the storm relative wind shear is gradually going to decrease as this approaches the coastline. This is breaking news here that you're watching, so you don't want to take this thing lightly. Look at the intensity now on the GFS. This is the new 12Z GFS showing the landfall near St. Mark's at 962 millibars. So definitely a stout hurricane. The models are trending up with this. And the further west, the GFS has always been further west than the other models. This would lead to a potentially significant flooding event in interior locations as well, moving through south central Georgia, up toward the South Carolina low country. This is Wednesday afternoon, so let's see what the timing is on this. Wednesday morning at 12Z, this is making landfall. That's according to the new GFS model. That's Wednesday morning at about 8 in the morning, but we're still going to see some surprises with this thing. I promise you that. Here is the European model that's even a little bit slower, a little weaker with the tropical cyclone, showing landfall as about a Category 1 storm, but the same location right near St. Mark's. That is a very difficult area to chase up there, right in the Florida Big Bend. It's difficult to access the coast. It's a little bit more remote up here as well. I was thinking Apalachicola would be a bit easier to intercept, maybe the Carabel area. But the further east it goes, I wouldn't be surprised if that eastward trend continues and takes it right in to the north of the Tampa Bay area, and then you get that destructive storm surge comes into the Tampa Bay area. But as is often the case of these tropical cyclones, you still have a lot of model disparity right up until landfall. So really anywhere along the west coast of Florida, from the Florida Panhandle all the way down to Fort Myers, needs to keep an eye on this tropical system. This is by Wednesday evening. That's going to be tracking right up the coastline. And I want to show you what it does here on the European model. It moves right up the coastline, right hugging the coast of the South Carolina coastline. Anywhere in this dominant rain band on the north side, you're going to have onshore flow, big time flooding. Myrtle Beach up toward Cape Fear. Wilmington's going to have big flooding as well, and up toward the North Carolina Outer Banks with this solution. And it's possible as it migrates out over those warmer waters of the Gulf Stream just off the Carolina coastline, it could even reinvigorate a little bit. Let's go back to the 12Z GFS if we're even out there that far. It shows it weakening definitely as it's hugging the coastline. Just too much influence with the land, but you're probably going to have tornadoes up here. Central South Carolina, up through the Carolina Piedmont. All of these rain bands coming ashore in the front right quadrant of this tropical cyclone are going to cause big time tornado potential. You get an incredible low level wind shear with these systems up in this area. Look at these strong easterly winds, and especially as it gets picked up by an upper trough, which is still forecast to happen. There's your tropical cyclone down there over the South Carolina low country. Go up to 500 and you can see this trough moving off New England by the middle to later portion of next week. It has just enough influence to pick up the tropical cyclone. Some of the other forecast model members that caused the tropical cyclone to meander off the Yucatan, it was meandering for so long down there that this trough passed off the East Coast, and then that opened up a highway for a further west track, and then that would cause the remnants of the tropical cyclone to migrate over the southern Appalachians, and that would lead to a mega flood event. Kind of we're seeing an average of that solution right over inland Georgia, South Carolina low country here. And look at the upper level winds too. You have 500 millibar winds. It almost becomes a lobe of this main trough off New England. And when that happens, that's when the tornado threat is even larger. But this one isn't getting picked up really by this trough. It's just a glancing blow that causes it to curl off to the northeast, and it kind of follows the weakness carved out by that upper level low as well that was just ahead of it. And really the steering flow on the northwest side of this high pressure just off Florida helps to accelerate it off to the northeast as well. So this high right here, coupled with the trough that's coming off the northeast coast, should cause this northeast steering flow right up the weakness, right up coastal Carolina, coastal North Carolina. And that seems like a relatively consistent, synoptically consistent steering flow off to the northeast. There it is, making landfall 12Z, hitting that very warm water just off the coastline of North Carolina. So if you're just joining us, we did have Tropical Storm Idalia that has been named. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it just yet. Idalia, or is it Idalia? It's probably Idalia. This is some of the latest satellite imagery showing that convective blob that pulled the center off to the south. If you look at infrared satellite, which is really a representation of the cloud temperatures, the brighter colors there show those stronger, hot convective towers and how hot they're penetrating higher up in the troposphere into those colder temperatures. You can definitely see a lot of convection out over the very warm waters of the Caribbean Sea. In general, this whole area is kind of a CAG, Central American gyre. You have blobs of convection with tighter mesoscale spin, and then you kind of have the whole area that's broadly spinning. But our tropical cyclone is right here with a slightly exposed center. And you can really see it on visible satellite. That's the center. Hurricane Hunter aircraft showing it down to 996 millibars. Eventually, it's going to start heading slowly to the north on Monday, and then it'll accelerate a bit as it gets closer to the Florida coastline. And maybe that will help temper a little bit of that intensity. The hurricane models show landfall as a Cat 1, maybe a Cat 2, but a lot of times these will underdo some of those positive feedbacks that will happen. And here is the official National Hurricane Center forecast. And let's take a look again here at the latest update. Thank you, everybody, for joining this live. I am going to be chasing this thing, of course. But I'm going to be leaving tomorrow. I'm still not sure if the Dominator 4 can even survive another one. So this is the 11 a.m. outlook. And it now shows it making landfall as a fairly powerful tropical cyclone, 90 mile an hour maximum sustained winds. That's significant as that comes in. So far this morning, the overall cloud pattern of the tropical cyclone has not become significantly better organized. The small center partially exposed on visible satellite imagery. Current intensity held at 30 knots for this update. A Hurricane Hunter aircraft flying at around 12,000 feet is near the system taking radar velocity measurements, and this data should provide valuable information on the structure of the cyclone for initializing the numerical weather prediction models. All those high resolution models and all the hurricane models will ingest all of this data that the Hurricane Hunter aircraft are collecting around the storm. It moved in a small clockwise loop overnight, probably not dissimilar from our Yuma, Colorado tornado that we just dropped a video yesterday, so be sure to check that out. Brian spent like 3 weeks on that edit, and it's basically one of the more deviant tornado motions that we've ever experienced, doing 3 loops. There was actually a 3rd loop added just before we dropped that video. But the Eli, Manitoba tornado did 2 loops. That was the first F5 tornado and the only F5 in Canada history. And when it was doing that 2nd loop, that was when it caused the F5 damage. And it looks like our low-level center last night did a loop as well, kind of within that convective blob. It's also embedded within kind of a larger, generally cyclonic flow with the Central American gyre. Steering currents will remain weak through today and tonight, but beginning Monday, a mid-level ridge begins to build just off of Central Florida and eastward. We were already looking at that, and that coupled with the trough off the northeast should help turn it north and eventually northeast over the next couple of days. Here's that mid-level trough. We'll likely turn it to the north-northeast and take the system across the northeastern Gulf of Mexico on Wednesday, maybe making landfall Wednesday morning, maybe even Wednesday afternoon. The official forecast track has been nudged a little bit right of the previous one, but not as far right as the corrected consensus to HCCA prediction. But don't forecast on the, or don't focus on the exact forecast track, because the impacts extend well outside of that cone, as we learned. Very warm waters out here, of course, over the eastern Gulf of Mexico. That upper tropospheric trough is forecast to develop over the western Gulf in 48 to 72 hours. Could produce some moderate southwesterly shear over the system. I think that's more due to that upper level low over the northern Gulf of Mexico. But yeah, that new trough that builds into the western Gulf, sometimes that can lead to diffluence over the system. And especially these smaller tropical cyclones, they can even intensify a little bit faster. But here was the update. Tropical Depression 10 strengthens into a tropical storm, and that's because of the NOAA Hurricane Hunter aircraft out there. Maximum sustained winds at 40 miles an hour, but that pressure is now down to 996 millibars. So definitely could be a fairly intense. Franklin, too, is forecast to intensify, possibly up into likely up into a major hurricane. There's Franklin, and the only issue here would be whether Bermuda gets hit, and it looks like Bermuda barely gets missed by Franklin. Just after Hillary, I was thinking about heading out to Bermuda to intercept this storm. You'll probably still get some big impacts as Franklin intensifies into a major hurricane, passing just to the north of Bermuda. That'll drag those very strong westerlies over the island. My good friend Andy Moore works as a meteorologist out there. We used to have some big-time battles in golf. I've been meaning to get out there and visit him and maybe do some golf ourselves. But yeah, it does look like Franklin's going to intensify into a pretty significant hurricane, and it's already doing so. Look at that thing, just ripping out there. Convection unzipping over that southwestern quadrant. That's going to wrap all the way around, all the way around Hurricane Franklin, and will help intensify it into a major. So pressure's already down to 971 millibars. And it looks like by late night tonight, it'll probably be a major hurricane. GFS ensembles take that thing over southern Greenland as a very deep cyclone. A couple of those members up there, 930, 940. It'll be an extratropical cyclone up near Greenland. But boy, if you want to get one of those mega storm surges, probably get on one of these camps on the south coast of Greenland as the system expands, and as it transitions into an extratropical cyclone, the wind field will dramatically expand as well. So southern Greenland will have a big-time storm surge there. Feeding off the relatively warm waters of the Gulf Stream. But all eyes right now are on Idalia. It is going to be headed up toward northwest Florida. This is a great place. Great home here to look at some of this imagery, tropical tidbits. I want to see if there's going to be a convective flare-up near the center. And you'll see those hot towers begin to develop. Probably by this evening, I bet we'll see a convective explosion in some of that rain-cooled air, kind of the hole between these two masses, or it might even wrap this back around. I think that the HWRF model shows some of this convection off to the south of the center, wrapping around a little bit. The center is a little bit further east than the HWRF showed, and the HWRF now shows this thing impacting Tampa Bay, and that's why Tampa Bay is still in the cone. Let's go see if we can get a better look at the visible. Oh yeah, look at that thing. Look at that center, guys. Look at that thing just winking at us right there. Definitely, and that's where that 996 millibar central pressure is located. Just as that little wispy high cloud passed right over the center, you could see it get a lot more visible. And look at that convection there starting to form just to the northeast of the center. The center is not surprisingly wobbling toward those hot towers. Those are like supercell storms just at the northeastern quadrant of that intense low pressure. Look at those things. Those are probably producing water spouts. They're producing a lot of latent heat release, leading to more pressure falls, and they'll cause the center of a young tropical cyclone to migrate even further east. So boy, I wouldn't be surprised if this thing continues to trend east and might even impact the Tampa Bay area. Still too early to tell, though. All we can do is sit and wait and do the model dance as the forecast models come out. We got to keep reloading them, of course. You got to look at visible satellite imagery, valuable data from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. But basically, it had this whole area that was kind of cleared out by this convective blob last night that propagated the center off to the south. Now the center's become exposed this morning, but definitely has closed rotation. You can definitely see Tropical Storm Idalia, the 996 millibar minimum pressure right in the center of that eye-like feature. That's the low-level center. Those are low clouds that are spiraling around a closed circulation. And I think here over the next few hours, we'll probably see this convection just expand just to the northeast of the center, and then it'll wrap all of that around. Might even intensify a little bit more rapidly, but the weak steering flow down here, a little bit removed from that upper level low in the north central Gulf of Mexico, is just going to allow it to sit there and spin. Let's making sure we're still live here. Looks like we're still live. How's it going, everybody? Welcome, new Team Dominator members. We are going to be going live on here, of course, for this tropical cyclone, the whole entire chase. I'm going to be teaming up with Andy Coates. You may remember him from the big chase there, the Cole, Oklahoma storm chase. He was a really calm one in the vehicle, very calm soul. And he's definitely going to have a very calming influence on all of us, of course, out there when we're chasing down this thing. I did want to pull up the ensembles. They're just now coming out. So we'll have to look at the 6C GFS ensemble. Thanks, everybody, for joining us here. Never stop chasing. Really, I should say, do not attempt. Go over here to look at the individual members. Oh. So there's our tropical cyclone. This is the GFS ensemble. And each of these centers are the individual centers of all the individual model runs that comprise the GFS ensemble. When they're more tightly clustered, there's a lot greater forecast confidence. This is the 6C model last night. And so far, the models have shifted east, especially the HWRF, the hurricane models have shifted east. The 12Z operational GFS and the last night's European model show a St. Mark's landfall. So I think that the GFS might be a little bit off with this further west track. And really that ridge that forms to the east of Florida will help bend this thing around with the anticyclonic curvature. Probably will move inland into Georgia, portions of South Carolina as well. A lot higher confidence with the 0Z European model last night. Shows some of these centers a little bit further to the right. The operational European model also has a landfall right near St. Mark's, which we covered Hurricane Hermine some years ago. I think that must have been 2017 when we chased Hurricane Hermine. Mike Tice and I were trapped on like a 5-foot mound of land as the storm surge came up. Got the rental car stuck, got the HERV stuck, the Hurricane Eyewall research vehicle. But I think that the ensembles, the 12Z ensembles that are just now coming out, will probably have this further right track identified. Let's go on over to the GFS ensemble. We'll go to 12Z. And it does look a little bit further right. Greater confidence too. It's probably going to hit the Citrus Coast portion of Florida, which is also kind of a difficult area to chase. Let's compare the 12Z ensemble to the 6Z. And boy, the confidence is increasing, but also the pressures are intensifying. So notice that trend from 6Z model over to the 12Z model. It looks like it intensifies it a little bit more quickly across the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Really, especially starting by Tuesday evening as that upper level low gets ushered out. High pressure forms off Florida, steers this thing off to the northeast, but watch out, Tampa. You got a couple members here on the GFS ensemble that are just offshore by Tuesday evening. So look at that, the intensity. Tuesday evening, this is at 8 p.m. Eastern as you go from 6Z to 12Z, bang. That's definitely a much stronger tropical cyclone, greater confidence too, but you are seeing this shift back to the east. We call that kind of the windshield wiper effect. The GFS ensemble is coming in hot, everybody. This is Tuesday night at about midnight. And boy, it is trending off to the right, isn't it? Still some differences in timing between the different models. These are the streamlines, 300 millibar streamlines. Basically taking this thing further right. You can see how a lot of the steering flow is southwest and northeast. Should pull this system off to the north and then eventually steer it off to the right. Wouldn't be surprised if we do get a further right track. But as that high pressure really consolidates off Florida, you should get this steering flow off to the north-northeast eventually. Can't wait till that next forecast time comes in. Pop it back out over here. Thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome new Team Dominator members as well. I do a lot of these in-depth briefings for Team Dominator members, which I enjoy doing. I'm not that old. I'm the same age as Tom Brady was when he won his last Super Bowl. Keep that in mind. I'm still feeling good too, taking the good stuff these days. Working out all the time. I'm actually in the best shape of my life, believe it or not. So I'm definitely not concerned about the physical side of chasing these hurricanes because sometimes you have to ditch your vehicle. May have to swim as well. I train all off season. We're calling it Idalia. 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 Yeah, I do think that the low country, downstate South Carolina, definitely could get some big time rain, and we should probably take a look at some of the rain as well. Welcome, new Team Dominator members. In terms of storm chasing years, too, I'm definitely, obviously not that old because you could storm chase well into your 70s, 80s. I know that I'll be storm chasing into my 70s and 80s. First, we're going to take a look at some of the rainfall here. I was kind of hoping for an easy chase, though, because these tropical cyclones are such a big commitment. You know, you go out there, you're getting soaked, just getting hammered by the rain. Look at all the rainfall. This is probably a lot of today. There's some severe weather potential up here in the southern Appalachians and portions of the Piedmont. But there's your tropical cyclone, of course, the classic double-digit rainfall out there. And this is also the 12Z GFS. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is even tilted a little bit further right. But really shows this area just to the east of Apalachicola getting ripped by big flooding. And look at the big flooding that moves into south central Georgia. This is going to convert to river flooding. You're going to get coastal flooding anywhere right of center. Even looks like you get one of those outer bands that will dump a lot of rain over the Tampa Bay area. And look at that stripe right through Columbia, South Carolina. This is going to be big time flooding rain. Wouldn't be surprised if it sets up a little bit closer to the coastline. So this is no guarantee, but you can see that if the storm system is a little bit further left and this rainfall is dumped over the mountainous terrain of the southern Appalachians, that's going to cause big time problems, big flooding. There's been a lot of drought out here in the southern Appalachians, probably have debris flows coming down some of those creeks. Central South Carolina, up through south central Georgia, northwestern Florida, gets racked, probably a foot of rainfall. At least it's going to be moving, though, and translating. I think that the threat of a stalling out tropical cyclone is quite low for this. But look at that in the Carolina Piedmont, probably a mega flood situation as well. But at least it is translating, so you're not going to see those like 30, 40-inch totals that you get with like a Hurricane Harvey or a Florence. But because you get such large aerial coverage with these tropical cyclones, you definitely dump a lot of rainfall. There's the European model solution. Look at what the European does out in eastern North Carolina. A foot of rain out there. Outer Banks, Cape Fear. A little bit further right of a track. Everybody will crush you for using the NAM model to do hurricane forecast, but we're going to do it. We're going to come on over to the NAM. It doesn't do a good job with the relationship between the ocean surface and these tropical cyclones, but it looks like it also has landfall near St. Mark's, just southeast of Tallahassee, and a ton of onshore flow. Look at that, those southwest winds ripping right up Tampa Bay. Probably like a 6 to 8 foot storm surge all the way up. The Citrus Coast as well, Manatee Country. But this is let's see what the new NAM, let's see what this 6Z NAM says. It's obviously picking up on that slower timing, isn't it? The NAM is even slower, making it landfall Wednesday afternoon, and it's further right. So the NAM model from 0Z last night to 6Z starting to trend a little bit further right, and this concave shoreline would have big problems with this situation. See what the 12Z NAM says. Even slower. So hell, we could even have a Wednesday late afternoon or evening landfall. It looked like it was going to be Tuesday night yesterday. Just shows you how fickle these models are, and that will likely still have a ton of surprises. That big rainfall right near the center by the NAM, but at least this thing will be moving. There is a hint that there could be a squeeze play and some potentially flooding rainfall up in Atlanta and up toward the upstate of South Carolina based on the NAM model. Wouldn't be surprised if that happens too. It's very hot and humid out here. And that high pressure should slide off the Florida coastline. There's our high pressure that forms. And it's not that well formed yet on Tuesday, but watch it intensify, and that should pull this thing off to the right. Yeah, it's really kind of the southern portion of this trough that really grabs onto it, isn't it? There's your tropical cyclone. You do get this trough that forms across the western Gulf of Mexico, and that could lead to a bit of southwesterly shear, but also a lot of times you'll get diffluence ahead of these troughs. See the cyclonic curvature digging all the way down into the western Gulf of Mexico? That's really the main steering mechanism as it pulls up ahead of that trough. But you do get this high that forms off the east coast of Florida and the trough, and the squeeze play between those two are going to take this thing off to the northeast. I do think that this trough might end up saving the southern Appalachians from a mega flood event and kind of focus over the South Carolina low country. See the strong winds, it'll want to have a desire to kind of turn to the south of that trough over the western Gulf. So, but it is possible that between this trough and that high pressure that forms, you might get some diffluent to loft over the system as it approaches the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, right when it's moving over those very warm sea surface temperatures. And that would cause even more problems. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Welcome new Team Dominator members. Definitely go check out that video, folks, from yesterday. Here, I'll drop it for you. See if I can find it. There it is. I'll post it for you guys to watch. We're so proud of this thing. There you go. Just dropped it in the chat. So that's the most deviant tornado motion that we've ever seen. And that was just a few weeks ago. That storm was during August 8. Check that thing out. But we do have the latest on Tropical Storm Idalia. Maximum sustained winds at 40. The movement is east at 2, but it's basically stationary. And during the day tomorrow, we should see this thing eventually moving off to the north. If you believe the trends in the NAM model, we'll likely even see a slower arrival time, maybe even on Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday late afternoon, a landfall. But notice how Tampa is still included in that cone. And remember that the impacts extend outside of the cone too. You'll probably even have some storm surge and coastal flooding down in the Fort Myers area again, even with that thing moving off to the west. But the cone even includes Tampa, the Tampa area. So it's very possible this thing could track right along the eastern edge of that cone and impact Tampa. It depends kind of on the strength of the trough that builds in over the western Gulf of Mexico, the corresponding high that develops here off of Florida. And you basically have clockwise spin around that high off of Florida. You have anti-clockwise spin from that trough over. It's really strung out. That's basically a trough over the northeastern U.S., but that should cause this thing to turn off to the northeast. But sometimes ahead of a trough like that and with a high, you can get some diffluence in between those two systems, which can lead to more rapid intensification. That's possible. That's what the HWRF is picking up on. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into this live update. Welcome, new Team Dominator members. Really, we just have to continue to watch the models, continue to watch satellite, the hurricane reconnaissance data. But I'm going to be heading down there tomorrow. So I'm going to be teaming up with Andy Coates, who is based also in the Southern Appalachians. He's my camera guy for AccuWeather. And we're going to head down there, sling live updates for Accu. We're going to be live streaming here, of course, doing our normal live streaming. Brian's going to be working radar, working satellite. We're going to be having the Ridge Riders out in the field, Brandon Kopic. Everybody's going to be down there. Everybody chases these big storm systems now. Look at that tropical cyclone coming into northwest Florida. Wow. Anyway, it looks like we have a pattern shift toward the beginning of September. Possible trough setting up off California. You got to wonder if that's going to lead to a monsoon surge over the southwest U.S. Maybe another tropical cyclone will come up into that area. But look at way out in the long range. It does look like we start to get a pattern shift with a trough taking over. But look at this blob, heat dome of a high over the central U.S. It looks like into early September, we're just going to see a continuation of that heat dome and the very hot temperatures associated with it. That's at midnight. Temperatures well into the 90s there. And the GFS usually will overblow the surface temperatures beneath these heat domes, but very likely into early September, you'll see those temperatures rocketing up into the hundreds. So that's what we got. We have a tropical storm. There's the update. That red update is at strength of 996 millibars. I'm about to go eat a meatloaf sandwich. The key is you got to really fatten up before chasing these storms because you never know if you're going to end up in a survival situation out there. 12Z intensity models, still a couple members take it up to category 2 intensity, but a lot of times these underdo those rapid intensification cases, especially those that are driven by diffluence aloft ahead of that trough in the western Gulf of Mexico. So wouldn't be surprised to see some trends even greater in these forecast models, the hurricane models. And we got a couple of these members that now take it over Tampa Bay, and that's why the cone, of course, has to include the Tampa Bay area. These are the 12Z hurricane models, tropicaltidbits.com. Great spot to look for those. A lot of times they don't do a great job, though. There's the 6Z. We're already looking at the new GEFS, so it should be coming out now. Let's take a look and see what it does. This is the new 12Z GFS ensemble. The good news is it doesn't show any members, at least down near Tampa, making landfall. This is 12Z Wednesday morning, showing a decent spread. Not a ton of them really intensify the system too dramatically. And so that's probably the hurricane models. The general models do show kind of a category 1 landfall, but you know how this song and dance goes. A lot of times these hurricanes will end up strengthening and being a lot stronger when they make landfall. But really what we need to see is if that eastward shift happens in the new European model, that usually comes out a little bit later than the GFS models too. So thank you everybody for tuning in to this morning update. I really appreciate everybody here. Thank you, Team Dominator members. Sorry, Justin, if you just moved to Florida. Hopefully you're not up in the northwestern portion of the state. And yeah, I'm going to be eating a lot of meatloaf sandwiches today to really get ready to chase this hurricane, because I'll probably be living off of Vienna sausages for a long time. Thank you, everybody. And remember those 3 most important words: never stop chasing. Take it easy, folks. Have a great Sunday. NFL preseason to watch.